Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time here, this is a podcast about political commentary, a sprinkling of philosophy, organizing psychology, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4AS. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. And of course, our other co-host, Kareem the Dream, our resident AI explorer extraordinaire. How are you going today, mate?
Good, good. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Actually, yeah, it's a juicy topic. There's a lot to unpack in it. So yeah,
Yes, but before we get to that, we want to trial a new segment of the podcast, which is Kareem's AI Explorer Corner,
yeah,
or Kareem's Explorer Corner.
yeah. I'm feeling privileged to have the opportunity to share some crazy ideas with everyone. So I figured the first one that I wanted to share today was the idea of a cognitive bias database. So now we have something called the Cognitive Bias Codex, which is uploaded on Wikipedia, which documents 188 different cognitive biases. Now, the reason why this is important is because while this links to the Wikipedia articles, if we're able to say take this database and train it in a way that we give it examples of these cognitive biases in action, and we give it examples I mean, that comes later. But if an AI actually gets trained on seeing these cognitive biases in action, then theoretically it should be able to not only point out cognitive biases in inputs that it receives, so point out our own flaws in our own thinking, but it should be able to identify it in its own thinking as well.
So, can you
So
give us an example of a cognitive bias?
sure. So say something like confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency for us to look for information which confirms our existing beliefs. So and sort of discount the value of information which negates our beliefs.
Right.
Now,
People don't do that, do they?
it's
People that
one
watch
of the
this
most
podcast
common
wouldn't do
biases that you will ever find. Like this stuff. And there's a reason for it. Like the reason for it is it kind of maintains psychological continuity. Like it helps us eliminate doubt.
Yeah.
So there might be situations in which that bias is actually valuable, because if we're walking around doubting ourselves all the time, like if you've got to spend 10 minutes making a decision which toothpaste to buy, like your life is not going to go that
Yeah.
smoothly.
Yeah.
So we need these mental shortcuts at times. They do, the idea behind it is that like cognitive biases are mental shortcuts. And the reason for that is because we're actually hardwired to preserve as much of our cognitive resources as possible. So it's an evolutionary thing. The more energy we can save, the more we've got to sort of direct it towards other things. So we're hardwired not to think too hard. So wherever possible, wherever we can implement one of these shortcuts the brain automatically takes it, and we don't actually know what's happening.
You know what? This explains so much, Kareem. I
I
really
think
wish I had this conversation with you earlier.
yeah, totally. Like I mean, yeah, you can learn all about it and still fall prey to it. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
So if we were able to say take something like existing, like the cognitive bias codex, and expand it out further into examples of this is what it looks like in action. And let's say we could open source the project so that over time we could get the community to actually contribute to, okay, yeah, I just noticed this bias. This is what my thought process was. And we give it rational alternatives of this is what a better thinking process might have looked like. This is what might have been sort of more holistic or representative of what's actually going on. Then theoretically we can get safer AI. The reason this is important is because the models that we have are trained on the text of almost the entire internet. They apply some filters to it. I was learning about this the other day. I I did a 3.5 hour video, Andrei Karpathy's Ultimate Explainer video on large language models. If you get a chance to check it out, it's 3.5 hours, but it teaches you pretty much everything you need to know about large language models. And what I realized was if text is trained on the entirety of the internet, then everything we write on the internet theoretically could be subject to those same cognitive biases. Yeah.
Right.
So what happens over time is the AI models actually inherit those biases and could potentially amplify those existing biases. So if we have a system where we've documented, okay, this is what we've studied, this is what we understand from the scientific literature, and if you wanted to expand it further, you could sort of say, yeah, the evidence is strong for this, it's weak for this, but just have it on your radar anyway.
Yeah.
Then like what we're actually doing is we're inoculating the AI systems against our own biases.
Yeah, that's interesting because like we did recently, Farias and myself did a podcast on AI Bill of Rights. And like a large section of the AI Bill of Rights was about the biases, the human biases inherent in the data sets that are training all of the AI out there, and then the reflection of that bias in the services that AI is delivering to people, and whether or not that is safe, like, you know, and manageable, all of the bias.
So we've got different strategies for managing those biases, but the way I figure it is if we can build a database where we can get to see these biases documented and in action, we can actually theoretically, and someone with more knowledge than me can probably correct me on this, but we can take those like base models, those base large language models, and fine tune it based on data from these cognitive biases. So it's just think of taking a larger model and sort of like tuning it more specifically for this context. These models already get fine tuned, you know, to go from predicting the next word in a sentence to actually becoming like a helpful assistant. And like the way they get trained on how to become a helpful assistant is they get given examples of this is what a helpful assistant would say. So that's how it gets fine tuned from just a sophisticated pattern matching machine to becoming actually a helpful assistant. A helpful assistant would say this, it wouldn't say this, like and so on and so forth.
Interesting.
But I mentioned that one only because I think it's going to be useful as a frame to you know, for this conversation as well. But I had just before we kick off, I had another analogy that I was going to share with you guys that I think might be a useful sort of way of looking at justice.
By all means, go for it.
Yeah. I promise I won't take too long with this, but I picture all humans as sort of running this evolutionary race. So, you know, picture a large group of humans running roughly all in the same direction. Yeah, like most people are sort of going to be headed in the same direction, but different people value different things. So, you know, some people might want to run off in different directions, and they've got every right to do that. Problem is, we've got some people that are racing out far ahead of the pack, and we've got some people that aren't moving as quickly. We've got other people like who are walking. We've got other people that are just standing still. We've got other people that are crawling. And some people have just given up altogether. They're like, I'm not getting any further in life. I'm just going to give up.
Yeah.
Now, the way I sort of look at it is we're not going to eliminate the gap between who's running out in front and who's sort of last in the race, like altogether. Because like different people are good at different things. They're going to evolve in different ways. You know, that's part of the process. But what we should be trying to do at the very minimum is trying to shorten the gap. And we should be trying to stop, because some of the people out in front theoretically are putting roadblocks behind them, are actively discouraging the people behind them from getting ahead. Which is what we don't want. We want everybody to be moving as fast as they possibly can.
Yes.
Right? Because that's what's good for the species. That's what's good for humanity as a whole.
For the herd.
Yeah.
That's brilliant, total. So,
Yeah. Okay.
No, you're right. And that analogy brings us to our topic of today, which is what is justice? Because actually, it was on a stream, one of your recent streams, MysterE. Somebody was kind of giving you the nth degree, or like trying
They
to
were.
of what you stood for and everything, and they
Yeah.
asked a
Yeah.
very curious question, which I think is a question that we haven't really sorted out as a society, which is, it was like, oh, what is your notion of justice?
Well, like it really stemmed from like, well, what the hell are you doing? Why do you do what you do? And I just said, like, I've always thought I had a sense of justice. And like they grilled me like it was some type of psych session. And they asked me if something happened in my childhood. And I was trying to recall if anything had happened. But like I just said, yeah, I've always felt like I've had a strong sense of wanting to see justice in situations and like take an ethical approach to decision making and all that sort of stuff. And that raised the question, then what is justice then, buddy? Like, you know, are you going to stand there from on high and deliver justice to the people, or is it like something a little bit more democratized than that? And so like, yeah, I thought it was an interesting question. And yeah, and you turned it into a topic for a podcast for us, and I can't argue with you on that one.
Well, yeah, I wanted to go through it because, look, me being a philosophy major and all of that, I want to bring in Plato and Aristotle and at least go through the old school notions of, Aristotle's Nico. What's it specifically called? It's the Nicomachean ethics, and obviously Plato's Republic as well, and at least put that as a starting block, because, like, you are right. Whenever there is leftist politics or the way things are run now, there's a very specific notion of justice, and what I've at least found through history as well as society as well, which is probably the argument that I'm going to make today, is that justice, order, and truth are kind of used interchangeably, or are kind of coupled together in various ways, but sometimes I find justice ends up being subservient to those other words, like what somebody sees as truth or what somebody sees as order, and like justice is kind of lost along the way. You'll kind of get where I'm going with it with my argument, but let me at least give you a bit of the classical Greek background before we kind of roll into my arguments. So I was doing some reading, and I was just going through the classics, and obviously you start with Plato's Republic, which he was saying, like, well, basically both Aristotle as well as Plato go into, what makes a good life, what is a good society, etc., etc. And at least with Plato, the quick brushstrokes of his argument is, well, justice in the individual is, you basically talk about the human soul in like three different parts. So there's the rational, so the logical thinking part, the spirited, which is the part that drives ambition and courage, and then the appetitive, which is the part that desires physical pleasures and material goods. And justice, according to Plato, at least for the individual, is where the three parts are in harmony, with the rational part ruling over the spirited and appetitive parts. The internal balance leads to a virtuous and fulfilling life. Now, this is where I think where order comes into the mix, at least for the ancient Greeks, is that justice in society later in the Plato's Republic is Plato talks about justice in society. So he extends the tripartite structure to society, proposing that just society mirrors the just individual. He divides a society into three classes. The rulers, so the philosopher kings as he calls them, who govern based on wisdom and reason. The guardians, which is the soldiers who protect and enforce the ruler's decisions. and then the producers, which are the workers that provide the material needs of society. Now, what's important is that the rulers are the philosopher kings, which in Plato's view are the people that are, the most well-adjusted, the ones that can kind of rationally think through everything, and he has this very high standard of what the
Sounds
rulers
quite
are.
lofty.
Yeah. And it's almost to the point where justice is, look, this is me interpreting it, but it's almost like justice is impossible for you to reach the philosopher king standard. But then Aristotle adds a little bit extra where he talks about the different types of justice in his Nicomachean ethics, is that there's universal justice, which refers to the general sense of lawfulness and virtue. A person who is universally just adheres to laws and acts virtuously in all aspects of life. And then this is where things get interesting. He kind of talks about there's a different type of justice, which is particular justice, which deals with fairness and the distribution of goods. So this is where we go into the whole idea of, okay, well, what did you mean in that last sentence? So there's subcategories of what I just said, which is commutative justice, which deals with fairness in transaction between individuals, and then surprisingly, which quite frankly is quite socialist, he then talks about distributive justice, which is, on the other hand, it concerns itself with fair allocations of resources and honors within a community. It is based on the principle of proportionality, meaning the distribution should be according to the merit or need. And after going through those kind of broad concepts, you can see that one, the Plato's Republic, it kind of feeds into our ideas about order, and the Aristotelian version kind of feeds into our ideas about kind of assessing justice within the community, but also kind of what isn't just. Because when you're kind of viewing that first particular justice way, as well as the commutative justice, when I was saying on the general transactions, what you're kind of focusing on is what isn't just, or what, isn't part of the transaction, what kind of isn't fair. So the broad argument that I kind of want to make today, which I'll use analogies like, superhero media and stuff like that, is that what I kind of feel like is that the distributive justice part of it, it's almost impossible for us to do because we're not philosopher kings. And in its stead, we kind of put the state in the order of things of they show what is just, what is fair in terms of the law. And as soon as we establish that it's really order over justice, suddenly the lines get blurred. And as soon as we're not able to effectively discuss distributive justice because, well, capitalism, and we're focusing on individual transactions on a kind of micro scale rather than a broad macro scale, then we start to focus on, hey, was that a criminal offense because you stole X? Was that a criminal offense because you did Y? And it's almost, you point out, hey, what isn't justice or what isn't something, rather than, hey, what is the establishment of what is justice? That's where I kind of feel like the coupling happens, justice and truth, or justice and order, and it almost becomes subservient to it. What do you guys feel about concepts like that? I know I threw a lot at you, so
yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that, but I think one of the most something that I sort of want to tie into the argument is against this idea of sort of justice needing to be rational. I've been looking into this, and there's a theory that the emotion anger actually plays an evolutionary role in that.
Go on.
The times that we feel anger, firstly, like when our individual boundaries have been crossed, or when we've actually witnessed the world working in a way that it's not supposed to work. So when we've theoretically witnessed an injustice. So these are the times when it is most likely for anger to emerge, as an emotion. So we've got this inbuilt evolutionary mechanism by which theoretically we should be able to identify injustice. Now, can it go wrong? Absolutely. There's a whole bunch of situations in which we get angry where we're not supposed to get angry, or our anger is out of proportion to what actually happened. So it's not a perfect mechanism, by any circumstance. And if we're defining justice in terms of what do we get angry about, there's a whole bunch of room for error in that. We could be subject to mob justice. We could so there is room for rationality in that. But the idea that it's inherently rational, I think probably lends itself more to this argument in terms of being more relevant to truth and order, and the idea that we're trying to make society predictable on some level, because when we live if we live under the assumption that the average person obeys the law, like the average person does not want to be punished for breaking the law, so theoretically they're going to follow the law. What that does is that gives society a set of guidelines by which this is the type of behavior that we expect from you. And that increases our ability to theoretically predict the behavior of the next person within society. Now, the example that I use is, like, I'm pretty confident if I walk out the front door, I'm not going to get stabbed. Like for the most part,
Good.
I don't live, I'm fortunate not to live in a place where I have to worry about that. But I look at, what are because I don't have to worry about that, I can do things like this podcast, for example, where I can think about other stuff.
Yes.
Because my safety is assured. I'm not in survival mode all the time. I'm not living in an unpredictable environment where I got to worry about who's going to do what if I step out the front door.
Yeah.
So
like, are you tying that then, this sense of predictability within your environment based on societal standards, as a form of societal justice then?
Look, I mean, this is it might not be perfect in terms of and again, this comes down to, is the law just? It might not be a perfect representation of what we feel is acceptable behavior within society, and it might not reflect everybody's view. And our views change over time as well. So, there has to be room for evolution in the law. This is why we keep making new laws and we keep going over existing ones. And why we've got people tasked with interpreting the context of the application of the law. Which by itself lends itself to a whole bunch of other problems, because in terms of consistently applying the law and the actual predictability of it, if we're taking a context-specific view, then...
I think context is really, really important. Like interpretation.
I do think context is important as well, but it affects consistency of application.
It does. So but I think humans are generally intelligent enough to place social norms above the law, if that makes sense. Because, like, there is kind of an understanding that a social norm and the law would align, as you've said, when you step out your front door, that you don't expect to get stabbed. So most people would probably think that that is not just a law, but a social norm, that no one should get physically assaulted and their life threatened when they step out their front door. But, like, it's also against the law to not cross at the lights or not cross at a crossing. And like most people, if they can look left and right before they cross the road and there's no cars coming, will jaywalk. Now that's illegal, but it's also a social norm that like if it's safe, just cross the road. So like I do think that there's a lot of context in people's application of the law, or whether they adhere to the law at least.
Let me ask you two questions. Firstly, is it appropriate to have laws which might not reflect social norms? Like say that jaywalking thing, for example.
Yeah.
Theoretically, it's meant to improve safety.
Yeah.
Right? It's meant to advocate for safety. That's why it's a law.
Yeah.
Is there any benefit to having a law which people break consistently? Like is there or is that like a tool of oppression, for example?
Well,
is that a way that we go back and say, if we're looking for flaws in what you've done, they're easy to find.
Yeah.
Because we've got a whole bunch of laws that,
there's a generally, I don't know if this is like more just generally progressive or leftist as opposed to socialist view on the law around like if you park illegally, let's say, and you get a fine because you've overstayed the meter that you were supposed to be there for 2 hours and you were there for 8 or something, and you got a fine. Now, people have argued that if the penalty for breaking the law is a monetary fine, that's not actually a fine based on, society standards about being penalized for doing the wrong thing. That's a class war issue in the sense that, like, there might be rich people that fine would mean nothing to. Like a $80 fine to a rich person is like, fuck, give me another one. I don't give a shit. But like if this person is poor and they can't afford to pay the fine and then they end up, racking up a few of those and then they get jail time, then like does the penalty for breaking the law actually reflect what society would call an acceptable response to that?
I think the penalty is meant to serve two functions. Like, firstly, it's meant to be a deterrent.
A deterrent,
for breaking the law. But secondly, it's meant to be like a remedy. In this case, a remedy against the state for breaking the law. Like, if you break the law, these are the consequences of breaking the law.
Yes.
And this is how we go back to restoring a state of order.
But I'm just saying, in a society like ours, if the penalty for doing the wrong thing is monetary,
so then that disproportionately impacts different segments of society.
That's right. Yeah.
So the question around, does it serve those two functions? We start to see the nuance in that question.
Yes, so. And then this comes down to a question of justice, because is it just to find someone that doesn't have the means to pay the fine? Is that the most just form of penalty for that person? And is it just to find someone $80 who is a billionaire? And this is the idea of the context dependent stuff. Like recognizing that there's going to be times where the law doesn't get it right. We can't afford for consistent application of the law. That's when the legal system is meant to step in and be like, hey, this is not how it's supposed to work. Yes, but the liberal ideal of the justice system is this concept of the law being blind. So if the penalty is $80, if you're a billionaire or you're dirt poor, who cares? We will blindly serve justice. And that is, everybody gets an $80 fine for disobeying the parking rules in this area or something like that. And that's blind justice. And that is justice. But some people would argue that is unjust.
Let me ask you about, again, going back to the idea of sort of, justice facilitating predictability. If we've got an inconsistent application of the law, then you walk out the front door and you don't even know if you're breaking the law or not. If we're introducing that level of uncertainty, not only might you not know if you're breaking the law, you might not even know what the penalties are associated with breaking those laws.
Yes.
And I guess you're not defending rich people or anything, but like if you know that the law is going to be be um, be focused on sort of targeting you,
Yeah.
or even if you're at the other end of the scale and you know that you're going to receive a disproportionate impact of of the laws that are made, like how important how important is equality in law?
Yeah.
Like is the notion of trying to reduce inequality invariably wind up introducing other biases or other problems with the legal system, or how much should we be focused on that sort of?
Well, the blind measure is supposed to be the ultimate measure in a liberal society anyway, because it's a measure of ultimate equality, which is that all humans or all people are equal under the eyes of the law. So, like, who cares about your economic position and whether you can, if you do the if you do the crime, whether you're able to do the time, it doesn't matter.
Before, then we wind up with rich people that don't care if they get a parking fine.
But like, this is the liberal ideal of justice.
So it's
blind,
trade-offs. Like,
you guys are touching on like basically what I was referring to before, because in this notion of justice, you're focusing much more on the individual rather than the community itself. Like just to kind of express more of what I kind of brushed over it.
Sure.
But communitative justice for Aristotle was talking about, equality in transactions. So the aims to maintain equality in exchanges, the rectification of wrongs. When an injustice occurs, such as theft or fraud, commutative justice requires that the wrong is corrected. And then voluntary and involuntary transactions. So he distinguishes between voluntary transactions like trade and contracts and involuntary transactions like theft and assault. Commutative justice applies to both, ensuring fairness and rectification in each case. See, this is where I kind of feel like superhero culture is like a very good framing an analogy of this. And I've been reading this book called Deeping It, which actually goes into the history of the criminalization of drill music in the UK. It's like a 90-page book. It's a fascinating read if you manage to get around to reading it. But there's like this little quip about criminality as well as crime fighting culture in the book. And the quote from it is, when we grow up, consuming encourages us to align with crime fighting and to shun anything associated with criminality. Some of the most popular TV shows for kids, past and present, are deeply carceral, centered on the otherness of criminals who stand in direct opposition and threats to the characters who we love and root for and should identify with. From Paw Patrol to Scooby-Doo, Ratamouse to Noddy, Spider-Man to the Famous Five, the eponymous crime fighters and their gang are on hand to show us what good looks like. The bad guys who return triumphant episode after episode, book after book, film after film, are vindicated by the victory of justice being served. These ideas are anchored through socio-cultural norms, or what Pierre Bourdieu called habitus, the social embodied in the individual, which implies a sense of one's place, but also a sense of the other's place. And I kind of want to show this in one of Marvel's recent series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because the figure that was supposed to be Captain America, the beacon of hope that is in American culture and whatnot in crime fighting, in this superhero like juggernaut, if we will. It's suddenly the second embodiment of it. It was the character who used to be Falcon. So, the embodiment of justice in America is now a black man, which was a very interesting concept because originally the original like Captain America was this white guy from World War II.
And Superman and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's dealing with that truth and justice and the American way kind of aspect of things. And what's interesting about it in the series is that they actually create a like progressive / socialist, like anti-capitalist antagonist for Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which they call the Flag Smashers. So, long story short, when Thanos blips half of the universe's population away in the previous installments, he basically makes international borders meaningless because the society has to kind of readjust itself, and borders are kind of opened up, and people are trying to realign like what society is with like half of the world's population just blipped out of existence. And when suddenly Endgame, Infinity War are over, and then that half of the population suddenly comes back, the Flag Smashers, this anti-capitalist group, erupt, who are internationalists that are like, hey, like, we actually kind of threw out national borders and all of that during the blip, and this was really good for society, and we actually established our internationalist group and were able to coordinate with other nations a lot more easily. Screw you, American government. Screw you, the global north. We want to reestablish, what we were going with, and we see it as justice that we keep this international movement moving forward. And what's kind of hilarious at the end of the story is that because, as I was saying in that quote before, it's in the end, this because it's going against the status quo, this internationalist group, they end up having to the leader of the Flag Smashers, randomly one episode just decides to kill a room full of people, and they're a criminal, they're an other of Captain America and the other superheroes. They eventually have to show them as evil, and what ends up happening is Falcon, who is now Captain America, literally turns to senators, so people that are in the US Congress and the Parliament, and he just does this massive speech which culminates in him pointing the finger at these senators and being like, hey, Senator, you need to do better. That's how we'll improve society. You just need to do better. And it just ends up being completely flat because it set up this really interesting talk of, hey, well, imperialism is a thing. Like, they even set up in the story that the fake Captain America that ends up rising instead of the Falcon, the black guy who ends up being Captain America, is just like this genocidal asshole who like kills. I'm pretty sure he kills like an Arab guy in the middle of like the Middle East, and like in the full American outfit, and he's like basically bashing his head in with a shield. Like, they basically play with the idea of like, oh, well, we're in a new society, maybe we need to rethink our structures and everything. But because crime fighting is, the fight against good and evil, they end up just completely throwing out all of the good issues that we're discussing, reinforcing the status quo, and finding that the order of, the senators being in power and the soldiers reinforcing the status of the philosopher kings within society reinforces the old order rather than reinstituting or at least rediscussing what justice is, and justice becomes subservient to order. And it's like, why did you even discuss that idea to begin with when you were just going to say, oh yeah, any discussion outside of the current status quo is evil, and we should just, everything is just fine before in this liberal democracy. Let's just leave it.
there's something that's inherently dehumanizing about the otherness of crime versus crime fighters that you touched on. That's that seems to be a major part of a lot of these narratives. I think for me, like this is a personal preference, but I tend to gravitate towards protagonists that are deeply flawed, and villains and antagonists that are deeply human, so that like we understand what are the conditions that gave rise to this person's like contempt for the world, or contempt for other people, and we understand these are the limitations of this infallible well, not infallible, but these are the limitations of this person that we placed in a hero role. So like both sides wind up looking very human, and are more easily able to relate to for the average viewer. But I think one of the things that sort of consistently I don't want to say it gets swept under the radar, because it's probably more on the radar these days than it used to be, is the idea that like within lower socioeconomic status areas, typically crime tends to be more prevalent. Like there seems to be something about the being in survival mode, which makes people like, these generalizations, and I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush here, but like what the statistics like point to is that like it tends to happen more within the communities of people that are struggling, that are in survival mode. And so I think one of I've heard of a few different sort of legal ways of trying to bridge the gap between how the disproportionate impacts of the law are being dealt with. And I think there was I was reading a book about an experiment in a New York courtroom where they actually looked at they prioritized the rehabilitation of the offender, by taking into context, like how are we going to be able to, reintegrate this person into society, to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel welcome, to make them feel like they have opportunity, and that they're not in survival mode. What will that actually look like? And there was another concept that I came across, this idea of restorative justice. Have you guys heard about that? Or it's this idea that rather than sort of like taking a punitive approach, the idea behind restorative justice is this facilitating this process of healing between individuals, or between, I mean, theoretically it could be applied broader than that. But say if someone gets traumatized from an attacker, the attacker gets caught, giving the victim a chance to express to the attacker, this is exactly how you've impacted on me. Like, this is what happened to my life from that point onwards, and framing it in a way that the attacker is actually able to understand, and is able to connect with the victim, and is able to sort of like facilitate a reparation of relationship, like between the two. That's at least my broad. I could have completely screwed up the explanation for that, but that's sort of my broad understanding of what restorative justice is. It's less about taking that punitive approach, and more about how do we facilitate healing.
It's interesting. In one of Graeber's books, I think it's in Debt the First 5,000 Years, 4AS, unless it's in The Dawn of Everything. But in a particular North American indigenous tribe, I think on the East Coast, but it might be more widespread, if there's two kind of clans, all groups within a clan, and one murders a family member of another, the way that they deliver justice is that the family of the victim gets to decide the fate of the perpetrator. And so, like, it doesn't always be the case that the victim's family will demand, ultimate justice in that scenario, like eye for an eye kind of thing. And like the brothers, I guess, of or sisters, if it's a woman, I guess, of the victim and the perpetrator's family will get together and negotiate. So the perpetrator's out of the negotiations, but the two families will come together and they'll decide between them. But the ultimate say does come down to the family of the victim. And so, like, the spectrum for them in terms of justice in that regard is that the family of the perpetrator has to come and negotiate with the victim's family. They have to present them with goods or some type of, I guess, compensation for the loss of the life. But they have to experience kind of through that negotiation process the impact that they've had on that family. And those victims and the people that have experienced the loss. And they kind of have to describe and like understand the loss and put that into certain terms. And then the victim's family kind of gets to make the ultimate choice at the end of the day. So there's like kind of a mix of like what you were talking about in terms of restorative, because like they have to live the experience and like go through the pains of that victim's family, trying to empathize with them, understand what's going on and be part of that negotiation process.
It is dead the first 5,000 years. I can't remember if it's the Nuer, the Tete, or the Lele. It's one of the African South American tribes.
Okay.
But like, I think what you're referring to is specifically a life debt. So that was tied to if somebody was killed. And with human economies, things were equivalent. Like they could, like a life was for a life. And I think it even got so complicated that, say, a certain tribe killed another member, like they would have to give like a wife, or at least a
in compensation.
In compensation. Not only that, but also I think specifically what happened was anyone that wanted to take on looking after the wife or whatnot, what ended up happening is she would marry the ghost of the person who died, and whoever fathered the children, it was not them whose child it was. It was actually the ghost, the person who died, and they would take on the characteristics of the dead person, and then it flowed on from there. Like it was a life for a life, but it was far more symbolic, and the person lived on through the male or the son or the daughter that was produced from that ghost marriage, if you will. And that was where the restorative justice happened, is that the life lived on through the children. So that's where the life debt was.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of doing things. And like, so like, I bring that up in the sense that not only like we were talking about before, kind of like justice has a lot to do with context. So like certain, whether you, adhere to the law or not is a context decision given the variables that are in front of you. Most people should be able to make a good guesstimation about whatever they're doing is right or wrong. But like context as well in terms of like the social standards of the epoch that you're living in, or the society or the culture that you're living in. Lots of different cultures have different understandings of what is just. So like, I remember being in I was in Uluru, and like we were getting a look around a sacred place in Uluru, and like this particular sacred place was only for women. And so like all the men in the tour group were to avert their eyes, like, don't look. And like, I thought that was rather ridiculous. I was like, look, it's an area, I get it, it's got cultural significance, but why do I have to avert my eyes? Like, why can't I look at it with my male eyes, kind of thing? And like the tour guide was kind of just like, if you walk past a women's toilet, would you try and peer in the door? And I'm like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, I think, of course I wouldn't do it. I'm not a grub. And they're like, well, like, it's the same context. You think that that's unjust, or you think that's unfair, or like crossing some type of societal boundary to peep into a woman's toilets. It's just the same type of feeling that you get when you walk past this sacred space. Men would be like, don't look at it, like, kind of thing. It's not fair. It goes against our social code. So like justice does also have a very particular cultural element to it. Because if you look at people like religious extremists and stuff, they can justify killing and some pretty horrendous stuff because of divine justice. And that's one scary form of justice, let me just say.
Yes, but that goes back to my fundamental argument that, what Aristotle was talking about with commutative justice is that it's a transaction, it's a one-on-one basis where it's quite easy for a society to establish, hey, you have, it almost to the point where I want to assert that justice almost is a negative definition, where like, oh, you are a criminal, you have done X wrong. Whether it's we throw you in jail or, we have a meeting as to, what wrong you did. It is quite easy for society to kind of identify that. But then, and that is tied with the idea of, along with truth, what someone's truth is, or it's tied to, again, to establish order. So it's almost as if justice is subservient to that. But as soon as we get to the macro level, that's when we start having problems with what justice is, because you almost have to be a philosopher king in order to establish what is true justice. And it's impossible. It's almost impossible for a fallible human to get to that sort of level. And society has had a harder time establishing what is just compared to what is not just.
Well, going back to like what I was saying about the role of anger, like it's way easier for us to be able to identify. Like anger is quite a strong emotion, like relative to other emotions. Yeah, like there's a reason why it's way easier to tell, if you're experiencing anger versus if you're experiencing shame, or if you're experiencing, a more nuanced emotion. It comes on strong, yeah, like it has a function behind it. But I get what you're saying around sort of, the negative connotations of justice, in terms of sort of figuring out where things went wrong, rather than sort of, looking at like how it's supposed to work. But and I was going to go back to the religion thing as well, because like my understanding of sort of, how laws, evolved is that, like the first set of laws that we had was pretty much like exclusively based around, like I think it was the Babylonians or the Sumerians or something like that, where I think it was Hammurabi's code of law. I learned that out of Civilization. Don't quote me on it, but there's this idea that it was roughly based around an eye for an eye. Like that was sort of the first set of laws that we had. That was as good as we could do at the time. And we've kind of evolved our understanding of justice like since then. But to me, like the way I'm sort of looking at it these days is, there is room for mercy and compassion, like within the law. And this was like sort of, what the major messages were meant to be behind religions. Like it was one of, the biggest messages of Christianity is and Islam as well, like having mercy and compassion. But the way that I try and frame it these days, at least when I'm trying to figure out, in terms of my dealings with other people, say I feel wronged, not in a legal sense, but, someone has crossed my boundary. The biggest question for me around, should I forgive that person or not, or do I have to do something about it, is the question of ongoing risk. Like, how likely is it that the way in which I've been hurt is going to happen again? Because if the answer is that person fully understands what they did, they feel remorse over it. I'm pretty confident they're not going to do it again. Then to me, the logical answer is, all right, just get over it. Like forgive that person. Like it's you're doing my best to acknowledging the harm that's been done to me. And that might be a simplistic way of looking at it, but to me, it's far more important if that person is likely to do it again, then I've got to do something about it. Like I can't put myself in a situation where I'm going to allow myself to continue getting hurt. So that's sort of the framework I use for trying to figure out when to use compassion and when a stronger approach is necessary.
So you have to kind of sum up based on the person and like their chance of reoffending, let's say, whether or not you dish out or seek justice in that scenario. And you can let things slide if
I recognize that, like, for me, it's there might be differences in terms of, how much we're impacted by, these things. That's irrespective of, like, if you've been absolutely traumatized by someone, even if they're not going to do it again, that doesn't mean you don't deserve justice. I just know that for myself, I'm doing my best to try and put it in the past. I'm doing my best to sort of try and get on with my life. That doesn't mean it's going to be that easy for the next person, and there's going to be variations in terms of how people sort of recover from the damage of But to 4IS's point, like we're still, I know my thinking around justice is still focused on that sort of individual level. Like when we talk about unequal distribution of resources and justice on a societal level, it's still hard for me to sort of conceptualize what does that look like? What does justice on that level look like?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it is rather a socialist style question, as 4IS has put it, like the distribution of resources. And especially in a society where there is a system of producing values, like things that people actually need to survive, which go beyond the capacity for everyone to consume. So there's an abundance generally. And so, like, I think you need to measure kind of a distribution or a distributive form of justice based on like what it is that's being distributed here. And like, if it's like, everybody needs food and water, right, to survive. And like you live in a society where, there's enough food and water to go around and like it's hidden behind a paywall. And so like the only people that really have access to it are those who can pay. And like a large majority of that stuff is wasted or thrown away because people can't pay for it. Then like you have to ask, is that really a just form of society? And so like, I don't know if there is a one size fits all approach to something like blind distribution. It should be based on the amount or the quantity of what is requiring distribution. Some things you'll never be able to distribute fairly because there's a limited supply of it. But like, I think in a society like ours today, where we could easily, in some sectors, like food production, as we have discussed, in housing production, we've discussed on this podcast as well, like we produce way more than what we need in terms of food and housing in advanced societies. I know that's not the case for all developing nations. But like, I've thrown out this stat a bit over the last like couple of months, but let me just do it one more time. Like in the US in 2020, they threw out the equivalent of $218 billion worth of food.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And so like, it's not, it's pretty well known that like there is a large portion of Americans living under the poverty line in America. And whether or not they get access to food or not might not be a question. Whether they get access to quality food is definitely a question that can be asked. And like the real question then is distribution. Like if they're producing that much food and in such abundance where they're wasting over $200 billion worth of food, Like, unless that's all like the finest, most finest dining kind of food that they're wasting here, like truffles and like, and
What
premium steaks or something like that. Like,
Yeah, like what's the
That
name
stuff's
of the
okay to
place
waste, or
where? Sorry, what was the name of the place where there's like a hill, like a
yeah,
cheese
in
hill?
Missouri or something like that, there's this thing
Yeah.
called the Cheese Cave. And so, like, apparently,
Oh,
this is a result of a policy decision by um, either Nixon or Reagan. Anyway, the cheese producers in America were producing so much cheese, and then they wanted to open up trade with Europe or something like that. And so, like, the cheese producers in America were just like, nah, we don't want to open up trade because, like, there's going to be an influx in the market. And they were trying to negotiate with the Europeans on something else. So they opened up the cheese trade with Europe. And so, like, the agriculturalists in America were kind of like, no. Well, if you're going to do this, then we want subsidies on the cheese because we're not going to stop making the amount of cheese because we want to make that money. So they agreed to subsidize the cheese industry. And there's a big cave somewhere in like Missouri or something where there are like millions and millions of like tons of cheese that like they just literally throw in a hole in a mountain somewhere. And so like there's this mountain of cheese somewhere in America.
you know,
And like
it's
there's
crazy.
literally there's a mountain of cheese, and like somewhere it's not like I don't think it's just like this pile of cheese somewhere. Like they're
yeah.
storing it too. Like they've got fridges and like storage units and everything. So like they're
So
ready
there's
for
an
the
energy cost
apocalypse.
attached to it as well.
There's a cost, though. Everything in
Yeah.
a market system comes with a price. But like they are obviously producing more than they can consume, and like they're housing it too. So like the question has to be asked when there is like global hunger, like the stat that I found, and like I don't know if this is true, I haven't fact checked this, but like the amount of money it was to wipe out hunger in the States was like $20 billion. So for like 1/10 of the cost of the food they waste, they could wipe out hunger
Is that
in
all?
America. Yeah, in the States. And I think it might be less than the amount of food they waste to wipe it out across the globe. So like the question really is distributive there. And so like if you wanted to create a just society, if there was some type of, I don't know, world government or like some body, like, I don't know, a strange body. Let's just pick up a
United
hypothetical one,
Nations,
like the
like,
United Nations. Yeah, let's
yeah,
just pick up a complete hypothetical, right?
yeah,
Like if you had like this random body like that, they could
yeah,
organize that sort of stuff. Like you'd
yeah.
have to
It's
ask
supposed to
yourself,
be able to, yeah.
yeah, you'd have to ask yourself the question, like, can we not, as a society, be more just in our distribution of resources? So, like, justice in that sense comes down to, and like comes right back to that personal question that kicked this off with that person in that stream a few like weeks ago now. Like, justice really does come down to me to be a sense of fairness, because fairness is context specific, it's individual specific, it's specific to cultural groups and all that sort of stuff. And so like a system has to be fair for me. So like, if you have a situation between two individuals and like one person gets treated in a certain way, and then the next person doesn't get treated in the same way given the same circumstances, like taking into consideration nuance and all that sort of stuff, and like if it's not a fair treatment between the individuals, that would strike me as an unjust situation by most accounts. So justice does come down for me personally to whatever seems to be fair in a given scenario. And that's, means tested, I would say, or based on a historical approach to those things. And so like, that seems to be context driven for me. And like fairness and justice and all that are rather subjective matters. And so like the problem with this conversation on justice is it's different for every person, I would say. Almost everyone would have their own concept of what would be just in any scenario and have their own independent thoughts and feelings on that. And they'd bring their own, life experience to the table on what is potentially just. And so like, all I'm saying, the reason that I bring that up is that like, I don't know if there is ever going to be a definition or an application of justice. Like in the liberal sense, like they have blind justice. And blind justice, as I was talking about before, is just a response to the fact that there used to be a very clear delineation between classes in the system that preceded liberal societies, which was feudalism. You were either the aristocracy or you were a commoner. And if you were a commoner, you basically had no rights compared to the aristocracy. Like they had fucking everything. They could decide whether you lived or died if they really wanted to. And if they barked an order at you in the street, you complied. And so like in the liberal sense, once they equalized society and broke down this definite caste system that comes with different like legal barriers and rights and stuff like that, once they broke that down, the idea was just like, hey, everyone's equal under the eyes of the law, and that should be sufficient. And that was sufficient 200 years ago, apparently. But the question is being just blind in justice good enough anymore? Well, 200 years later.
You might have hit the nail on the head of something that I wanted to bring up, is that I guess, we can only talk from, I guess, a Western liberal democracy standpoint, but at least from where we are sitting right now in society, I almost think that it's we've been trying to obviously answer this question all the way back from Plato and Aristotle. But I think the way things sit right now is by design. Because the thing is, yes, it is easy to discuss like, oh, this one-on-one interaction on this one-on-one transaction, is it just within those two parties that are concerned? And that sort of negative definition of, is that fair, is that unfair, or is that unjust? It's quite simple to look at that almost black and white, looking at a law of said thing. However, as soon as you start to focus on distributive justice, so something that is affecting things macro-wise, sure, there might be different interpretations, at least at first, but as soon as you have everyone asking the question, hey, on a societal scale, is that a just price? Or is it just that businesses work on for profit? Or is that just that this law affects certain people in a disproportionate way compared to others? As soon as you have everyone in society asking that question, then maybe that might go in a different direction that the people on top don't like.
Yeah. And that's why a lot of ideological positions, culture, and like the way that society is structured feeds off, and this is a historical materialist perspective on this one, but it all comes from the base. Like all of that stuff is part of the superstructure: culture, ideology, laws, social norms, arts, sciences. Everything feeds off the economic mode, so the mode of production. And if the mode of production is centered on a relation which is between kind of capital and labor, and everything really stems from trying to make sure that that relationship is maintained so you can reproduce society. It's not nefarious or evil or anything like that. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But like if the basic relation in society to help everyone continue to live in that society is a system based on like, some people control the means of production, so like a bunch of capitalists, and like other people work for them and like they produce value so everyone can survive, then like the whole society, its culture, its understanding of the world, its outlook, its sense of justice and fairness boils down to like maintaining that relationship. And so like the whole question of what is fair is supposed to reinforce the relations of that style of production. And so like if all the roads lead to Rome there, the only way to re-ask the question of what is fair on a macro level, which is what you're talking about, 4IS, the only way to reframe that question is to revolutionize the system. And here we are, Revolutionary Think Tank Podcast 2025, baby. Oh, yeah. Like, it's the only way to, like, on a macro level, reframe an entire conversation. Like I was describing before, when they changed from a feudal order where you actually had a class system, like an actual distinct class system, like, it was pretty fair back in the day. People thought it was fair that, like, that noble over there gets all of this land and gets to tell me what to do. That was normal. People thought that was fair. For like thousands of years, we've lived in class systems where people are just like, yeah, they're a noble. They get certain birthrights that I don't. What's wrong with you? That's just how we do things here.
You know, that probably links back to the philosopher king sort of like way of looking at things. This idea that
there's a king
possesses the rationality or the wisdom to be able to make decisions on those levels. These days, I might not go any further than that.
But like these days, our symbol of fairness is not a philosopher king. It's the woman with the scales. The scales, like what an exchange society we live in today, where like we judge things off someone with a blindfold on, a scantily dressed woman with like holding scales, right? Like it's just like, okay, you want to come to the marketplace? Well, it's tit for tat. We exchange as equals in this society. It's a very interesting notion of what justice is when you look at it like in terms of its symbology. It's pretty actually in your face when you think of it like that.
Well, to kind of just bookend what you were saying is that, well, let's even go back to what Plato and Aristotle's time. Like in ancient Greece, the people that have equal status, or at least was seen as equals, were the men who were the citizens. Yeah. Everyone outside of that,
but it's outside of the...
well, it just didn't matter. Whereas nowadays, at least what we like to think in a liberal democratic society.
Be careful what you say there. Hey, look at what's happening with the mass deportations right now in Trump's America. Hey, not everyone's an equal. As long as you are a citizen, then you are an equal.
Well, look, where I was going to say is that we like to think of ourselves that we are equal above the law, but you know, in light of that situation, it's the reason why we have such cynical phrases like all men and women are born equal, but some more equal than others.
Yes. I thought actually you were going to go to the fact that like in Aristotle's time and Plato's time, they were all like, hey, philosopher king, and this is just, and this is how you live a good life and stuff like that. But like they were basically living off the backs of a slave society, and they had absolutely no problem with that. Like there is nothing in their works which is just like, well, you know, this is just and this is right and this is fair and all that sort of stuff. But you know, I'm saying this as someone who's basically lives in a society where slaves do all of the hard work for us, and like I'm benefiting directly. No mention of it at all. No mention of that might be a problem in their whole worldview of justice and rights and like morality and ethics and all that sort of stuff. No questions there. It's like, yeah, some people are slaves. Get over it. And so this is like goes back to that conversation that I was having before about like, you know, it's kind of the mode of producing things and where value comes from in your society, who helps you perpetuate your society, which frames your sentiments on justice. And these two philosophers in particular, no questions about whether slavery was just or not, or was even ethical.
Yes, but who was a citizen and who was an equal in their society is very different. It's very different from what we consider now. Is that like there's a huge difference between the mythos back then compared to now. Is that, you know, Aristotle.
No, again, I'm just saying it's rich for them. Like, given our, like, you know, in hindsight for us, it's rich for them to be talking about ethics and justice when, like, they were slave owners.
It could be rich for us to be discussing this, you know, in the eyes of people that are going to be living, you know, like 50 years.
It will be. It will be. And I hope
they're going to be like, how on the money are these guys in terms of their thinking? How way off are they? Like,
Yeah. And they're going to be like, undoubtedly, they're going to be like, God damn, that revolutionary think tank podcast was so far ahead of its fucking time.
Yeah.
We're still learning from them today. That's what they're going to be saying to themselves.
Role models. Like,
Okay, and you know what, guys? I think we've had a pretty good discussion today. And of course, the last segment of today is what's that synthwave art? Who wants to have a crack at it?
I'll have a crack.
Oh, yeah?
This is obviously after the like post-war 1950s period. They're trying to refashion the justice system in America, and this is a scene from Mad Men, and they're trying to sell the idea of justice to Americans, and they're sitting around thinking about how they should market that. That's what this is about, marketing justice. Marketing justice.
Meeting, isn't it?
Okay, so
It
what actually is the prompt is philosophers trying to discuss justice and how order rules society.
Do they all need glasses?
How order rule, yeah. Okay, so philosophers trying to discuss justice and how order rules society and discourse. Is the pen truly mightier than the sword?
Oh,
Wow, that's why there's pens. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Love that.
That's that was a difficult prompt. I'm sure
It's
you're.
just more and more thinking really hard. Like, I love that.
But it's very Mad Men, Ash. I wasn't expecting that, actually.
It is.
Yeah.
It is rather. Yeah. Neon Madmen. Sorry.
Neon Mad Men.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be a really good anime.
Yeah. Why not? Why not?
Anyway, and with that, Cream, thank you for joining us again as
Okay,
our
yeah,
fellow
as always.
co-host and trialing your Explorer Corner. I thought
Yeah. Happy to share some ideas, and looking forward to sharing some more of them. So.
Yeah,
Please.
no worries. And remember, everyone, to keep thinking and keep learning. And to sign us off, I'll give it to you, MysterE.
Thank you very much for IS. And if you enjoy the episode, you know the drill. Like, share, subscribe, etc., etc. Leave us a comment too, please. And until next time, please remember, I am, you are, we are a MysterE.